Hello team, and welcome to another ATPGEO politics video with myself, Jonathan M.S. Pearce. And I always say this, I am super excited to be joined by my guest today, insert guest name, because I always am. I'm always excited to speak to experts and people with experience on all sorts of things. But particularly today, I literally have goosebumps. And I have goosebumps because I genuinely think this is the most important discussion we should be having from a political, societal, personal point of view. Before I do the full introduction here, here's just an article that I think it kind of sums this up: the greatest security threat of the post-truth age. So this is from BBC Future a couple of years ago after COVID. The terms national security or cyber security may be familiar, but what about epistemic security? And you guys have heard me talk about epistemic security before, which is the idea epistemology is a study of knowledge and truth. And if we don't know what's right and wrong, truth from fiction, then we've got some problems. So that's what we're going to talk about today. And I'm joined by Eliot Higgins, who many of you will know as being the kind of godfather of Bellingcat. Eliot, first of all, thank you very much for coming on.
Thanks for having me on.
Do you want to just introduce the audience to yourself? They might not know who you are and what the genesis of Bellingcat and your work was.
Yes, so I'm the founder of Bellingcat, which is an organization that both performs open source investigation, but also teaches other people how to do that. Open source investigation is using publicly available material to investigate a whole range of different topics. And it's especially become, I think, a major form of investigation in the last 15 years with the introduction of the iPhone and the spread of social media, allowing more people to share information, connect to information, along with the growth of platforms like Google Earth, Planet Labs, for example, satellite imagery, marine traffic, all these different ways to get information about the world around us. And open source investigation is really about bringing that together for the purpose of investigation. I started my own journey basically arguing with people on the internet and wanted to win those arguments.
Didn't we all?
Yeah, I was on the Guardian Middle East live blog back in 2011, just getting frustrated that on the comments there would always be arguments about, oh, is this video real or not? And it was always about ideology rather than actual analysis. So I just wanted to know what was going on, and there just seemed to be all this interesting information. So I realized that you could look at the landmarks in photos and videos and actually match that to satellite imagery, and started doing that to kind of win my online arguments. But that was really the birth of kind of geolocation in terms of a technique on to verify where things are. And that's something that I think lots of people do now, both professionally and in social media spaces. But for me, it wasn't just about doing the investigation. It was understanding that this was actually a really valuable way of understanding the world. And the more people doing it, in my mind, the better, because it's evidence-based, it's transparent, and it's a way to understand the world.
Yeah, and indeed, talking about geolocation, that was one of your kind of breakthrough moments, wasn't it? Was you were involved in the geolocation of the Book surface-to-air missile launcher for the MH17? Is that correct?
Yeah. So in 2014, I decided I wanted to go from, I had a blog called the Brown Moses blog, which was named after a Frank Zappa song I'd been using as my pseudonym for a number of years. But it was like it was literally like the first template I clicked on when I started Blogspot and just started blogging away, because it was just kind of like a personal thing to begin with. But as it kind of got bigger and bigger, I wanted a space where people could come together and do open source investigation and learn how to do it. So I decided to launch a new site called Bellingcat. I crowdfunded that in July 2014 and actually started on July 14th. 3 days later, MH17 was shot down over eastern Ukraine. 298 people were killed. And there was a lot of open source information that people really weren't looking at because they hadn't really been introduced to the idea that they could do that. But very quickly, people started digging through stuff, sharing it online. And I was able to use those techniques I developed over the previous 2 or 3 years to start verifying this stuff, but also identify other people who are doing interesting things in the same area. And we kind of formed a little investigation team and really started finding out a huge amount of information about what happened to MH17 and who was responsible.
Did that get you sucked into concerning yourself with Russia, because Russia have long been a purveyor of disinformation and spurious activities? are you particularly interested in Russia, or do you see that this problem as a global issue that is affecting us all everywhere?
Well, I think it was the open source investigation as a field really developed around the Arab Spring. Right. And Syria was really, I think, where my own work really focused when I started kind of blogging rather than just arguing on the internet. And it's basically the same thing. But that's when I kind of saw communities growing around the conflicts in Syria.
Yeah, because of course Seymour Hersh was one of the big issues, and the barrels of chemical agents and whatnot.
Yeah, so in 2013 there was the August 21st sarin attacks in Damascus, and I played a pretty big role in finding information about that attack because I had spent the last year and a half looking at YouTube videos and social media accounts from the Syrian opposition that were now being used to share information about these attacks, but mainstream media, journalism, policy, government, whoever, weren't really taking any notice of these videos. So I suddenly become a kind of nexus for all this information about, the munitions that were used, the victims, and tons of other information. Now, that's a couple of months after that, Seymour Hersh publishes an article in the London Review of Books that is frankly complete garbage. And based off the open source evidence, you could pretty much systematically show step by step why it's complete nonsense. And that kind of rose my kind of profile quite a bit because of the arguing with this Pulitzer Prize winning journalist, but also bringing the evidence. I brought the goods, and he brought a vague source that he wasn't able to name.
Which he did with the Nord Stream 2. I remember writing an article. I mean, unfortunately, all my articles don't exist online anymore because the websites went down. But I wrote, that's 4,000 odd articles that exist in the ether somewhere. Don't exist. Anyway, that's another thing. But I wrote one on Seymour Hersh because the Nord Stream 2 article he wrote was just, again, it's just, you think, come on, you're better than this. But then you start understanding that maybe he's got a handler, he's got people that he's using as sources who are themselves compromised. So yeah, that's a big scalp. How did the international community, or how did the journalistic community take what you did there?
I think in terms of journalism, I had already built a kind of reputation among a lot of journalists for the transparent way of doing these investigations, and that I was an outsider, but I was still producing good quality investigative work on things like the use of barrel bombs, chemical weapons, that really wasn't getting the same level of coverage because simply journalists couldn't get on the ground and investigate these things themselves. So I think among a lot of the kind of Syria Watcher type journalists and among policy and human rights organizations, I'd built a good reputation, and that they knew that when I, was presenting my arguments, that I was doing it backed by evidence. And when Seymour Hersh was presenting his arguments, he was like saying, trust me, bro. We had the 2013 sarin attacks, then we had the Khan Sheikhoun attacks in 2017, which Seymour Hersh also did something for Die Welt that was also complete nonsense. And again, the open source evidence showed how that was false. And then we had Nord Stream. So there's a bit of a pattern developing in how he was writing stuff. I don't think he's kind of working for the Russian government or anything like that. I just think the sources he's using are unreliable, and he's not really doing anything to kind of fact check or verify the information that he's being provided because he trusts his sources.
Which brings us on to something that I want to talk about a lot later. So this is a bit premature, but there's motivated reasoning as well. So we're going to talk a little bit later about true believers and as you would define them, and how you end up believing what you believe. So for Seymour Hersh, there's going to be an ideology that he wants to write to defend or to promote, and that ideology. So there's motivated reasoning for him to reason in a way that Nord Stream 2 was done by this, and the sarin here, those conclusions feed into his overall worldview. So maybe that's a good segue into, and of course you were involved in Alexei Navalny and in the documentary as your team, one of your team members in that featured heavily in the documentary. Sorry, it's a sidebar here. That must have been good for you, for Bellingcat's PR, if you like.
Yeah, I mean, we've been producing a couple of documentaries since. So we did a documentary for National Geographic, a 3-part one on MH17 that was released earlier this year. And for me, that was just kind of almost drawing a line under that, almost a decade of investigation into that. So that really go through our investigation, the story of MH17. We did one that called the Kill List, or also Antidote, depending on which format you're seeing it, which looks at the cases of poisonings by Russia. That's really interesting because we actually had a Russian chemical weapons expert who worked on developing these agents, who was kind of escaped from Russia and told us a lot of information about this and provided an awful lot of evidence to support his claims. That also involves the story of Vladimir Kara-Murza, his imprisonment, his poisoning, and then his eventual release as well. We're also working on a documentary at the moment on a massacre that took place in Syria several years ago called the Tadamon Massacre. And that's really interesting because the perpetrators were catfished by a researcher, a very brave researcher from at the University of Amsterdam who investigates genocide. And she was using that to kind of get into kind of why they could perpetrate these terrible things. But she discovered that there was video footage of this guy killing, over 30 people in a really horrific incident. And the whole documentary is going to be about that. So we're trying to, bring these interesting, unique stories where there sometimes is an element of open source investigation or just investigative work to the broader public.
Yeah, and that I just want to fly off on all these different directions at the moment. So talking about like how do you do valuable work, and why aren't, or maybe they are, I don't know, why aren't governments just fully like engaging with you in a way of like, this is amazing, we want to fund you to the max, or how do we get your critical thinking and analytical tools into schools? Anyway, we'll come to that later. Just a little snippet, maybe what we'll talk about. Yeah. Sorry, carry on.
No, I was just saying that a really big part of what we're trying to do is bring this to as wide of audience as possible. But also, as I'll talk about in a minute, that there's actually fundamental changes in our information system that are creating threats that we aren't really dealing with. Yeah. And I think that's partly because I think, especially in Western governments, politicians often become kind of middle managers to neoliberalism. That they'll say, we can be as free as to work as hard as we want, but just leave it to us and we'll figure stuff out. But they're now, it's kind of like in the UK, we go from prime minister to prime minister, because I think they're dealing with a version of politics that existed in an old information system, but we've now moved into a very different system that they really struggle to cope with.
Right, I'm so glad you're talking about this, and again, we're ahead of the game. So because like I keep coming back to with my audience talking about, well, with social media, the tech companies, the only solution is some form of regulation. They are not going to self-police. The governments are the only people. Like the EU is in a great position. Canada was in a great position of putting a digital sales tax on the US, but now in a trade deal that's been scrapped. And you're like, that's a way in of trying to curtail these massive tech companies from being able to control our lives in so many ways. And we need to be able to like strive against that. Otherwise, it's I don't want to get all Terminator futures and whatnot. But yeah, anyway, that's later. Let's go to your model of disordered discourse. What does that mean? Why have you chosen that term, and how does it all flesh out?
I will attempt to share my screen with you. So fingers crossed, everyone, as I attempt to do this. Okay, you should see my PowerPoint slides now, if I've done this correctly.
Yeah, I need to remove mine, so that would make sense. Right, there you go.
Okay, so this is almost the start of a journey I began about a year ago, trying to really bring together the idea of how people believe in conspiracy theories. And it's started for me that, I'd been obviously dealing with people around chemical weapons, MH17, all kinds of topics who believe in conspiracy theories. But I watched a documentary called Behind the Curve about the Flat Earth movement. And it involved a lot of the major figures, and they went to a conference that they were holding. And it struck me that these people were very, very similar to the people I was encountering on very diverse subjects, Syria, MH17. So I started thinking, maybe there's a common mechanism behind this. And what is that mechanism? First, I just want to think about democracy and what are the functions of democracy? Because I think it's pretty important to actually understand that. We don't talk about democracy enough. We don't actually think about how democracy works and also why democracy fails in many circumstances. So I have these three core functions. One is verification. It's the way in which we in democracies attempt to find the truth. And often that's done through institutions. We have the scientific method that informs academic work. We have editorial controls that informs the work of the media. We then have
sorry, and I know I'm going to annoy you because I'm going to interrupt you at these key moments. But verification is an interesting term philosophically, because you get verificationism, and there are different models. There are different theories about how we find truth and how we do epistemology. So, you know, coherence, pragmatism, verificationism, falsifiability, correspondence theory of truth, all these kind of things. Have you looked into the underlying epistemological theories, the philosophy of truth much?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of my work, I won't bore everyone to death about it at the moment, but a lot of my work I'm talking about here is really looking at all this work that's been done within philosophy, you know, like work on authoritarianism and how important the truth is in terms of democracy and how the lack of truth leads to authoritarianism. All these ideas that I'm presenting in terms of verification, deliberation, of the next one I'll reveal, are very much based on kind of really looking into those ideas and saying what are the commonalities between them, even if they may disagree on how we reach those goals. What in a way are the democratic ideals in terms of function?
Okay,
so trying to establish truth, yeah, we all want to know what the truth is, even if we don't strictly understand that in terms of verification. But deliberation is the next part, that we have spaces and opportunities to actually discuss things, come to conclusions, and take action on that. And in the ideal world, that's as inclusive as possible. Then we have accountability, that there can be accountability, you know, that the powerful can be held to account, that action can be taken when we've had this verification and deliberation process. But if you don't have one of those, then the other two functions won't work. If you can't verify stuff, what are you deliberating on, and how can you have accountability? If you can verify and deliberate stuff and there's no accountability, then what's the point of the first two? And I would also ask people that you can ask yourself a question of whether or not this is happening in your democracy by asking the question is, can I know the truth? Can my voice be heard? And can the powerful be held to account? And I think if you actually ask yourself those questions, you often will find yourself saying no nowadays. And that's, I think, part of these
the US is fecked, isn't it? I mean, just on those three, I was thinking, yeah, oh dear. But anyway, sorry, carry on.
Yeah, so I describe something I call the arc of democracy, which is the idea that these are ideals. No democracy can ever really achieve these ideals because society is far too complex, but we can set up the conditions to kind of move towards these ideals. But we can also regress away from those ideals, and that regression moves towards authoritarianism. You can see this happening very clearly in the US at the moment, you know, hour by hour. But I was kind of looking at first, how is kind of this false information, conspiracy theory spread? So I came up with this presentation you're about to see, Demanufacturing Consent, How Disordered Discourse is Destroying Democracy. I like my Ds. So it started with the work of Walter Lippmann. So Walter Lippmann was a journalist who worked through World War I, and then in 1922 wrote a book called Public Opinion, about how public opinion is actually formed. How do we as a public come to this consensus? And he says that the real environment is altogether too big, too complex, and too fleeting for direct acquaintance. And he came up with this idea of pseudo-environments. So the world is seen through a lens of institutions, the media, the government, whoever it may be. And that's then consumed by the public, and they create a pseudo-environment, which is an imperfect version of the world, but it's almost a shared understanding of what the world is like. You know, the grass is green, the sky is blue, water is wet, and so on and so forth. Now, we don't have to agree politically on what that actually means, but we at least have a shared version of the world. I would argue then when this came along, that was blown up completely. So in 2007, the iPhone was introduced. And what then happened is we had social media platforms who served as bespoke information, information that was designed to engage us, not necessarily truthful, verified, or having gone through any kind of institutional process in the first place. And we end up with everyone splintering into their own pseudo environments based off the information that they're consuming. And this can be seen through the idea of, you know, internet bubbles that we all become kind of consumed in. But I was then saying, okay, then let's dig deeper into that process. And I came up with the idea that disordered discourse is created through a process that is fueled by social media. And it starts with four elements, or four dimensions rather. First is the elements, and these are the kind of fundamental particles of disordered discourse. Then the drivers, why people share this information in the first place. the agents who are sharing this information, and then the discourse itself. How is this discourse curated? So we can look at the elements first. And this is based off work by Claire Wardle and her colleagues on disordered information. I was trying to keep a kind of consistency in the language, hence disordered discourse. So you have 3 types of disordered information. Misinformation, which is false or misleading information spread without the intent to deceive. Disinformation, which is shared with the intent to cause harm and deceive. And then malinformation, which is true information, but caused with the intent to harm. So that could be, leaked emails that are, framed in a misleading way to fool the public. So once we have those elements, we can look at what the drivers are. And there tends to be a lot of different drivers. You have, a whole bunch of structural and technological drivers, algorithm incentives, that kind of thing is quite a big one. There's psychological and social drivers, as you were saying before. It can be identity and community reinforcement, cognitive biases, a whole bunch of things. And the political and economic drivers as well. And in an individual or a group, these may vary to a certain extent, but some of them will be present, and some of them are the drivers behind why this is being shared. Then you have the agents of disordered discourse. I often got very frustrated that so much of the discussion about disinformation was focused on foreign actors. And really, there's something very, very different happening here. So I said there's official state, political, and government actors. So, these are government officials who are aligned to us. So, there's a lot of those. Then there's the proxy state, political, and government actors. And these are kind of covert and overt. So on the covert side, you would have the Internet Research Agency, Unit 29155 of the GRU doing disinformation campaigns. On the overt side, you'd have Russia Today, Press TV, people are working on behalf of the government, either in the open or secretly. Then you have the self-interested actors. So these are people who, may just be trying to make money from the algorithm. And it doesn't always have to be a huge scale thing. It can be you retweeting something that you agree with that's not political, but it's also untrue. And you kind of know it's untrue, but you just think it's, causing a bit of drama on the internet. All the way up to people who build entire brands around their personalities, trying to make money off people, grifters, stuff like that. And then at the center, you have true believers. And this is what I think is really essential to understand, that people really, really believe this stuff. It's not because they've been tricked by Russia, but it's all those different drivers that push them to the point where they believe stuff that, most people would think was completely bonkers. And often we look at this as these external actors, tricking people into believing this stuff. But often we're looking at systems that are interacting with each other. And it's kind of like the idea that you'll have a group of people in the middle who really believe this stuff, but those other actors will produce content for them to consume because they're trying to exploit that belief. But those people then be propagating it to other true believers themselves. So it's kind of like when disinformation and misinformation, it's actually the intent that's important. So disinformation can be shared with true believers, but when they reshare it because they believe it, it's then misinformation.
Yes, of course. Yeah. Good point. Can I? I'm just going to bring something in to,
Sure.
if I may, to sort of back up what you were saying there, because I remember sharing with my audience some research by, I think, a Swedish media outlet that talked about how a video that was created, I think, in Egypt was then shared, but it was done basically by the Russians covertly. This aligned channel creates this content that is disinformation, and then it gets picked up by local media that then gets regurgitated by maybe more national media and then international media, and then Russia import that and then regurgitate it as, look, we're reporting on what the international media are saying, when they actually sowed the seed. And there's a really, which is kind of what you're saying, that's the true believers getting manipulated by all of these 3 elements in order to propagate this disinformation. So this is the EU versus disinfo, which is interesting. They come up with some model of disinformation. I haven't really looked at this, but they've, although this is the only image of it, so it's blurred, it's not perfect. I can't find another image of this online, but this is this what you're talking about? So sort of non-attributed, this is certainly what I was just mentioning, so video channel comes up with some content that is aligned to, say, the state, let's say Russia, for example, then it gets picked up by state-linked channels, then state-controlled outlets, and it goes out, and then it comes back in, and it gets kind of, I guess, sort of verified, scare quotes, verified by mainstream media. And as soon as it gets that kind of labeling, then this bit of information can be repackaged by, in this case, Russia, who can put it out on their mainstream media outlets to say, look, this is what's actually happening because we've seen it from international media outlets. Is that germane to what you were saying at all?
Yeah. And another example of that is how what will often happen is Russia will identify either true believers or self-interested actors who are saying the sort of things that they I want them to say. It can be like the white helmets are bad, or Ukraine's evil. Then they invite them to a press conference at the United Nations where they sit down to
Jackson Hinkle.
Yeah, Jackson Hinkle being an example. Vanessa Beeley was another. Eva Bartlett was another example of this around the white helmets. They then film, these people speaking about the evils of whatever group is disliked by Russia with the UN logo behind them, and then that's shown on Russia Today as geopolitical experts talking about these issues. So you're seeing how there's that kind of network of exploitation for the benefit of those groups. The true believer or the self-interested actor gets a profile, risen by appearing on, at the UN. They feel good about themselves. Those official state actors can then use that with their proxies to promote that to their audiences and reinforce the true believers' beliefs about what's happening.
So if we put that model into Jackson Hinkle's example, it would be that the official state, so Russian state, would get some kind of proxy entity to contact Jackson Hinkle, who is that one at the bottom, the self-interested actor. So he wants a grift. He doesn't really believe necessarily about, what he says about the Donbass, about this, about that. I don't know whether eventually he can come to believe this stuff. There's an interesting discussion there. But he's then contacted by these entities and then say, oh, you should come to the Donbass. So they then bring him there. Then he says what he says. And then they take him to the UN. And then he says what he says at the UN, which is part grift, part manipulation by these other entities. And then the people that are viewing what is said on the UN, from the UN or at the UN, are the true believers, and then go, look what Jackson Hinkle, who RT says is an expert, says about this, it must be true, type thing. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it's just a cycle that feeds itself. They're always looking for, that you have actors who are trying to constantly reinforce this cycle of information, because really what you're dealing with are closed information systems, and those systems can kind of be radicalized and reinforced. So if I move on to the next stage, it's then how this disordered discourse develops. So often it starts with asking questions like, are COVID vaccines safe? Can we trust Ukraine? Stuff like that. Depending on your kind of individual drivers that could be algorithmic, social, psychological, you'll then engage with information. And that engagement itself drives more information towards your direction, because the algorithm, the communities you engage with, will send you more information. So the algorithm says, oh, you want more stuff on Ukraine being bad? Here's more stuff on Ukraine being bad. Oh, here's a community that agrees with you that Ukraine is bad. So you have a group identity formed. Sometimes that group identity already exists because the community already exists. Sometimes it forms around a new topic. And as that group identity forms, there becomes certain almost moral values that are instilled within those people that, if you stray outside of that value set, you can become ostracized by that community. And eventually those ideas become fully institutionalized. And that includes, sets of sources of information, be it, websites or individuals, social media accounts that are trusted within the community, but also police the community as well. That, when someone strays outside of the groupthink, they get attacked. And eventually that becomes discourse absolutism, where not only is the topic you're initially interested in seen through the lens of that community, but every piece of information you encounter now is seen through that community, because that becomes your entire media ecosystem. And that creates the lens through which you see the world.
Question, because I think about this a lot with myself, and actually I can apply this to you and your community, website, group, however, Bellingcat, however you see what you represent and who your community is. Like, I have a channel here where I ask questions, I get engagement, I engage very heavily with my audience. I trawl through the YouTube comments to have arguments with people, and like very rare for YouTube channel owner to like spend so much time engaging. But I think it's really important. But then you get a group identity naturally. I have my team here, and then people who are Russian trolls, we then kind of get rid of them, and then you get an institutionalized kind of thinking that goes on, and then you get discourse absolutism. So I worry that can happen to me. What about you with your own situation?
So my argument is basically everyone kind of is involved with the questions and engagement stage. But it's then what you do with those next steps and how those principles of verification, deliberation, and accountability are part of the way the group operates. Because what starts happening then is in disordered discourse, verification really becomes about only certain pieces of sets of information being allowed to be used in the discussion. Now, we can have a kind of discussion about, sure, we wouldn't use the gray zone, for example, as a reliable piece of work, but that's because we would tell ourselves that we verify information, deliberate over it, and look for accountability, which the gray zone probably doesn't. But then we need to. So in a disordered discourse, verification is really about reinforcing what the group already believes. Deliberation really becomes about a loyalty test. That any discussion always has to come back to reinforcing the group identity, and if it doesn't, then the people involved with that are going to get in trouble. And then accountability is always about the outgroup. I'm sure you've seen a million times where someone within one of these communities says something that turns out to be completely false, but it has no impact on their standing within the community because they're loyal to that community. And this is kind of where you can start saying, okay, the difference between what you could call democratic discourse versus disordered discourse is it upholds those principles of verification, deliberation, and accountability, even when it challenges the assumptions of the group. And I think sometimes it is easy for groups to kind of slide into disordered discourse, even with the best intentions. And I want to make it very clear as well that these people are not being drawn into this disordered discourse because they're evil, bad, immoral people. Often they're very, very moral people, but the drivers that have led them to the point that's drawn them into this discourse have kind of created a kind of system where they reject a set of information by default because they've lost trust in where that information comes from.
Yeah, and that's going to be a huge thing. You're going to talk about distrust in institutions. You get iconoclasts or people who are anti-authoritarian. I used to be, to some degree, I'm just going to put us back on. I used to be someone who was kind of anti-US imperialism, right? And I think justifiably so. But because there are elements of the US history, for example, that are getting involved in places and for the benefit of the US, which is, I guess, kind of natural. But then there is like messing around with people's democratic processes and whatnot. And then I look at Ukraine, and actually the alignment of the geopolitical strategizing and the morality of Ukraine is actually, luckily, really good. So I recognize that helping Ukraine is good morally as well as good strategically, as well as it being in the best interest of the US and so on and so forth. So, but it would have been easy for me to be kind of some anti-US imperialist to go down the, NATO expansionism, blah, blah, blah. And I kind of see almost that's where people like John Mearsheimer and Jeffrey Sachs and these academics and even Seymour Hersh, like is there an issue when people do it from an academic point of view, or is it just exactly the same kind of processes going on here? So I'm just coming up with lots of scattergun.
Yeah, I know exactly what you mean. I mean, I also came from that kind of very kind of anti-imperialist background. I read a huge amount of, like, way too much probably, kind of Chomsky and stuff like that when I was younger, and I very much came. I grew up during the kind of 90s and the invasion of Iraq and everything like that, but I think those key moments are actually really, really important in how the public kind of defines their trust in the institutions. So I'll just come to the point on the institutional capture, because this relates to the same point. So what we've seen in the US in particular is disordered discourse capturing institutions, and that happens in a process. So it begins with the institution being exposed to disordered discourse. So think of it like the Dominion scandal, where Sidney Powell gets an email from a clearly not well person who's like talking about how she's been spiritually decapitated, but also says Dominion has been involved with the election scam. So their incentives align because they're trying to prove a point based off their beliefs. And then that becomes integrated into the narratives of that institution. So Fox News starts having Sidney Powell on talking about how Dominion is bad. But the problem is that then creates a behavioral capture, because now that audience expects to see that content. And if they don't produce that content, then the audience is going elsewhere. And we can see this actually in the emails from Fox News in the Dominion case, that this is exactly what they were afraid of. And then it becomes embedded in their structure, where they start making decisions about how the institution is structured based around that disordered discourse that has captured their institution. And that creates a decision-making process that's fundamentally flawed, because the problem is distorted. So the solution is always going to be flawed. And because it's flawed, it fails, and the captured institution has to deny it's failed, which means externalizing blame and further radicalizes the group.
Can you put that into a real world example, maybe even using Fox News and Sidney Powell and Dominion?
Well, I mean, you can kind of look over to America and see every time Trump tries to do something that fails terribly. It's like when he was going on about tariffs, it immediately has a huge impact. They have to, deny that it was actually their fault, that there was some other factor involved. They're blaming the woke media or whatever it may be. But it further kind of reinforces the group identity and kind of it happens constantly all over the place. I mean, Dominion is a good example of this. There they had the problem that their process met lawyers, which then caused them a huge amount of problems. But if that not had happened, they keep on doubling down on it and reinforcing it. So this is kind of
but that's super important. That's super important. Sorry to interrupt again, but so we've just heard Gavin Newsom come out and say, I am going to sue Trump for 787 million. No, I'm not. I'm going to sue Fox for 787 million because of what Jesse Waters said with regard to whether I was phoned within a day or not by Trump. And there's a whole thing about basically Fox were lying about what Gavin Newsom was saying, etc., etc. And he's like, this is very similar to the Dominion case, and we're going to basically kind of go down the same route as that. But it's actually been said since the Dominion case that the only way to jolt the systems back into aligning with reality, with for news organizations to not to lie, is to regulate by litigating. Is that a fair synopsis of where we're at?
I certainly think in America that the law is really the last line of defense, and that's being kicked over constantly at the moment by the Trump administration. So they may lose a court case, but will they ever actually pay anything up or take the action that they're supposed to do? I mean, I don't think so. They'll just keep lawing away until they can get away with as much as possible, and then ignore the outcome anyway. And I think those are the kind of signs that you have to look for in terms of, you can go back to the verification, deliberation, and accountability structure, because definitely verification and deliberation has collapsed in the US, and the accountability part is under extreme threat at the moment. And it's almost like you look at as well in terms of how these groups police themselves as well. It's like the Tulsi Gabbard thing, where she gave a statement saying Iran was nowhere near, and she would have been very, very much against these Iran strikes, but now she's falling back in line with the group. But it's also interesting to see Musk and Trump falling out as well, because Musk, the dynamic there is going to be interesting, because Musk is obviously wealthy, but I think of this dynamic, Trump can say, oh, no more subsidies for you, Musk, and then he's going to lose a lot of his wealth overnight. So that might be used to get him back in line. But I also think maybe Musk is a little bit of a wild card for chemical reasons.
And also for all sorts of different motivated reasoning reasons. So, like, for example, he's going to want natural resources from Russia, like steel and aluminium. He's going to want natural resources from China, rare earth metals, etc., etc. He wants to access the market in China. He's got factories in China, and then he's got subsidies and all the contracts he's getting through the government, and then he also has a platform which is heavily involved in disordered discourse, right? And so, like, you're right, it's just that's a fascinating dynamic, and that could go any which way. And last night he was railing against a big beautiful bill again, and you're thinking, oh, which way could this go? Because then he's got his own set of followers, Trump's got his own set of followers. There is an overlap, but is, and then you've got cognitive dissonance and cognitive dissonance reduction. You've got all sorts of stuff going on, and I'm just sitting there eating the popcorn.
So I think what you're going to see is a lot of loyalty tests starting to happen. And I think you'll see a split between who's loyal to Musk and who's loyal to Trump. And I think a lot of that's going to go Trump's way in terms of the institutions. What happens next? Maybe Musk will fall back in line and give Trump another 300 million in a couple of years' time. Who knows? But I think it's also really useful to look at this moment through the lens of the post-World War I period. Because we have now a moment where there's a huge amount of distrust in institutions across the West for a variety of reasons. I really think that primarily started probably from the invasion of Iraq onwards, where we saw those kind of three pillars of verification, deliberation, and accountability that were really kind of put into practice by the institutions that the public trusted being completely demolished. And that, in terms of verification, we didn't see, there was a whole story about WMD that didn't pan out. In terms of deliberation, there wasn't really much real debate that happened, and huge protests had no real impact. And then finally, we had the lack of accountability when everything went wrong. So we then had the financial crisis. So trust has also collapsed again because of that in the public view, and then the internet comes along. But if we look at the post-World War I period, there's also a huge lack of trust in institutions in that period in lots of countries, because there'd been a horrific 4-year war. Millions of people had died. They knew they'd been lied to by the press with stories of kind of Germans bayoneting babies and German body factories and stuff like that. And they had to rebuild. And they weren't just rebuilding their countries, they were rebuilding democracy. And in the UK and US, that meant more voting rights, that meant actual kind of social support being created. For example, the British Legion in the UK, the expansion of unions, even though in the US that was kind of cracked down in the Red Scare to a certain extent. Now, that wasn't perfect and it wasn't fully inclusive, but it did build kind of these democratic ideas in the 20s and 30s in the US and UK. And that also failed in other countries as well, particularly Germany. And we all know what happened there. And we're kind of, I think, seeing the same situation again, a rise in authoritarianism because we've lost trust in institutions. But there's sometimes when you talk about this, it's like people think, oh, it'll fix itself somehow. But that's not what happens. You actually have to do the work. I also think it's interesting looking at how the UK and the US and other countries rebuilt Germany and Japan as democracies based off their experiences in the 20s and 30s of building democracies. And they were successful in that goal. We then come to the 60s and 70s, where there's a philosopher, Nancy Fraser, introduces the idea of counterpublics. So these are things like the feminism movement, the civil rights movement, where they form their own publics, where if you look at them, they uphold those ideals, democratic verification, deliberation, accountability ideals within that counterpublic, and that influences the mainstream public to change, not just on a surface level, but systematically. But then I think we come to the 80s and we start having kind of a more PR-focused politics, one that is more about managing the political system. It's almost kind of like this idea of the end of history. We figured everything, there's no more, racism and sexism, all that's kind of been fixed. And now we're in this, neoliberal.
Fukuyama and yeah.
And then we have this kind of idea that really it's about making people kind of free to work as hard as they can to be as successful as possible and leave the politics and running things to us because everything's kind of stable now. We've got rid of communism, so it's fine now. But that doesn't really work out. And if you look at Russia, those neoliberal ideas really led the democratization of Russia, and it failed miserably because they weren't primarily restoring those three key or building those three key functions. They were trying to say the market will figure itself out. Go to Iraq, rebuild in Iraq, it's the same thing. And we immediately see kind of Iraq's markets being opened up to foreign investors. It's the market will help build democracy. Which grifting and corruption seems to get in the way of all of those three elements that you talk about. Yeah, because it's the idea that there's some pure market logic that will kind of save democracy or rebuild democracy is completely insane and doesn't work in practice. And we've seen that in Iraq, Afghanistan, we've seen that in Russia. But it also means that when there's real moments of crisis, countries don't really know, politicians don't really know what to do, because they're trying just to sustain the status quo. And then when we get into this period of the last 15 years, where the whole information system changes from a top-down, institutional-led gatekeep system of information, where we're just recipients of information, and we get to vote and form our counterpublics around that. Instead, what happens is we have a peer-to-peer, many-to-many system where those verification, deliberation, and accountability functions are kind of flattened into us ourselves. We aren't just receivers of information, we're distributors of information.
That is right. Okay, a couple of points. So one, I think there's an interesting sidebar. It's not necessarily germane to anything you said, but it's interesting that the World Happiness Report that gets done every year, and it's a really big report. It's not just generated by, how much do people smile? It's a whole plethora of different inputs that go into this, and one of them is trust in institutions. And actually, so the higher you have, the more trust in institutions you have as a nation, generally the higher up the well-being ladder you're going to be. So I think that's an interesting correlation, interesting little thing there. I don't know if you have anything to say about that.
Yeah, I kind of been thinking of it in terms of how we kind of develop our moral values in democracy. And I'm not just talking about how Christian we are or something like that, but the very functions of democracy in moral terms. And if you think about how our media, our society talks about those three functions, verification and deliberation and accountability. If you're watching a TV show about lawyers, there's good lawyers and bad lawyers, and you know who they are based on how they behave. Saul Goodman might be an interesting character, but we know he's a bad lawyer. He's good at doing what he does, but he's a bad lawyer in terms of morality. We watch a show about, a bunch of plucky journalists, they're finding the truth and leading to accountability. And, we're constantly reminded that these are moral functions of our society, of our democracies, as much as ideals. And the thing is, when we see institutions betray those ideals, it's a moral betrayal as much as it is a democratic betrayal. And when you have people who are drawn into disordered discourse, it's because often I think it's because of moral injury, that they felt betrayed by the system that was supposed to do these things.
So that leads me perfectly onto my second point I was going to make, which is part of the issue might be that, and I'm just spitballing here, literally stream of consciousness. So part of the issue might be that the like you said, with the iPhone generation that we live in now, the era that we're in, there is almost too much information on stuff. So if you go back 50 years, right, no one knew what was going on in the hospital down the road in terms of the management of that, in terms of the outcomes, the data, how good the hospital was, blah, 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 what people's work profiles were like. We have so much information. We have so much peer-to-peer swapping of information that we're involved in, and there's much more transparency. So on the one hand, you might argue, we wouldn't intuitively argue that transparency is a great thing, but actually there's so much transparency now that we can very easily see all the negative points of everything. And because we probably have a negativity bias, we're going to be focusing on where the hospital goes wrong, or where the local council goes wrong, or where this goes wrong. And I've seen all this on Facebook, and I've seen, so everything, you just get I think a bias for negativity and a process that, I'm sure if we looked at like negative news versus positive news, I wonder if data would show that negative news spreads faster. And so actually we live in a more transparent society now that is almost geared to give us greater distrust in institutions. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I think that comes back to how our information systems have changed how we interact and discover information. One is that if you look at verification, deliberation, and accountability in terms of how it operates in these many-to-many social media environments, verification is actually happening within the individual as they receive information that's coming through algorithms that are serving them information designed for engagement, which tends to be stuff that either reinforces what you believe or makes you angry. Yeah. And if you don't have, and you're the point of distribution then, and there's millions of you doing that. So it's a very, very powerful thing that no longer has that verification function within it. And although that was imperfect before, at least we had a trust that the institutions were able to provide us with verified information. But that trust has collapsed really over the last 20 or 30 years in particular, I would say. Deliberation used to take place in not only a space, but also a time. That you'd get the morning newspapers, you'd watch the evening news, there'd be parliamentary debates. It was kind of slow, but it was also allowed people a chance to react, think, and talk. Now it's just a constant stream of stuff being blasted into your brain that all you can really do is think, oh, I like that, I don't like that. That's the deliberation you get, and that makes me angry. And that means there can't be any accountability because the functions that are needed for accountability don't work. So we end up with a performance of accountability. You know, we have people shamed off the internet. We scream loudly at someone on the internet and they get upset and they leave or they quit their job. And that replaces real systematic accountability. And I think we also have, because of really the collapse of those spaces where counterpublics could form in the past, that everything's kind of moved online, where we think we can, you know, we're having a debate online when really we're just screaming at each other. That opportunity to build effective counterpublics that can impact society isn't really there in the same way it used to be. So what we need to do is, when we look at this and think of a solution, is not to look back to the 20th century and say we need everyone to trust the newspapers again. We have to think, what are we actually rebuilding from the ground up that engages people with the democratic process in a way that allows them to rebuild their individual trust in institutions while understanding they're existing in a very different information environment.
Yeah, because what we've left behind, and I was talking about this the other night in the pub with my mates. I was saying, look, you know, we no longer have only 5 channels or 4 channels on TV, and we no longer sit and watch the news at a certain time of night, and we no longer, you know, have this slow TV approach or to taking in data. And my friends are like, yeah, so what? It's great. We can binge watch Netflix. And I say, yeah, that is all brilliant. You can do all that stuff. But because we live in the I can get what I want when I want it, and live in that bubble of only getting that, like, you're not almost forced to sit down like and sit through the news on a like Thursday night before you watch the channel, the series that you want to watch, which is on at that particular time. And that, now, yeah, it's great that we don't have that, but actually what we're doing is we're eschewing mainstream media, and these mainstream media outlets are generally, although not well, in the UK at least, are regulated, right? So when the BBC and Sky News say something, there's fact checking, and they can't just publish lies and blah blah blah. And the same with our print media. That's not the same with Twitter, and it's not the same with these people who are not seen as publishers. And so we've got a change of society where we're like, we can get what we want when we want it. I think of my kids, like, when do my kids ever watch the news? And at their age of 14, I've got 2 14-year-old twins, and like, they never watch the news really anymore. They're on TikTok getting their news from TikTok. And I'm like, you are being fed, oh, no wonder you've got a rather positive view of Andrew Tate. Like, we need to talk about this. So like, everything is up against us in terms of getting a healthy diet of verifiable information. So as you said, we can't go back in time. So how do we deal with this?
So the way I'm approaching this is, I've developed something called the ARC framework. So in terms of the arc of democracy, that we either work towards these ideals of verification, deliberation, and accountability, or we regress away from them. And the default state in this current information system is regression. So if we don't do anything, we might as well buy jackboots, because we're going to have to wear them pretty soon. What we need to do is start looking. I've identified 8 tracks of activities. It includes education, investigative infrastructure, sustainability, but activities that move towards these ideals of verification and deliberation and accountability. And then what I'm doing at the moment is mapping these out and looking at opportunities where, you know, there's work being done with local people in different types of groups, and seeing how that can connect to other types of groups. So to give an example of that, Carl Miller at Demos, he's working on a program called Waves, and that is looking at how you connect local people to local councils so they can have more say and influence in the council's decision making and more understanding of what the council is doing. Because one thing that's important is, you can have the best democracy in the world, but if people don't see it in action, they won't know it's a good democracy. You also have work like Jonathan Hayward's doing at the moment with the co-creational media model, where he's looking at how local media organizations can work with local people to identify stories that the local people are interested in. And that was often a function in the past that was performed by traditional local media, but that's collapsed, and that's being replaced often in many places by independent local media. Then Bellingcat's doing work. We go into universities, help them develop course material around open source investigation based off their interests, and then we create investigative hubs at these universities. So there you can immediately see 3 projects that could align with each other, that you'd have the open source investigation work being done by the university hub, that's working with local media informed by the work of local people, and that then can inform the local opinion on what should be done, the public opinion on what should be done by the local council. Now, if you start scaling that and doing that across a country, what you have is local people engaged with these topics, rather than going onto Facebook and getting all their local news from there and just getting mad about stuff that they have no real influence over.
I can't remember and where I was reading this or seeing this recently, but there is a country that funds local media through some way. I forget where they get the taxes or the income from. It was a very clever way of being able to fund local media, because they know that local media is dying. And so a certain amount of the money that comes from here goes through to local media to fund that, even though it's not like market success. It's so important to have local media, because, you know, like, I'm really worried about the death of mainstream media and local media. So people are too quick to slag off mainstream media, because when it goes, like, then you'll be like, oh, that was really important. So, you know, when we go to Twitter to find information, generally what we're doing is we're using Twitter, for example, as an aggregator. It synthesizes all this stuff, or it doesn't synthesize it, it just has all this stuff. And then we go, oh yeah, I'm going to dip into that Guardian article I see there, or that New York Times bit. But if we didn't have the mainstream media, then we wouldn't be able to do all that. And then, you know, we need reporters on the ground doing the reporting, but we also need investigative journalists. And you would know this as much as anyone in Bellingcat doing the investigations you do. If we don't have models that can sustain investigative journalism, that is part of the accountability aspect of your 3-part model. Like, you need governments to be held to account by big investigative journalistic efforts. And I worry that as we are going into the internet world, where we're not buying newspapers and we're not signing up for mainstream media outlets enough, then we're going to lose that, and that is a poorer world. That's a more dangerous world.
And what that results in is all those functions become performative in democracy, and people recognize that, and then they start looking for alternatives. And this is exactly what's happened in the US. There's lots of people who feel that the system hasn't served their interests, that they can't see there's going to be any real change, so they're going to the loudest guy who promises them the world, and then he himself fails to deliver. But the hope is that, you know, by the next election in the US, that people will still be able to vote if they're Democrats. You know, it's getting to a scary point in the US. But we need to look at how we rebuild our democracies. One, I think the local media aspect is really important, but it's not just saying we need more local newspapers. It's how do they serve the interests of the local people. We have opportunities to network with them, different types of organizations which can support their work. I mean, we lived in a network society, so let's take advantage of that. We also need to look at young people. The thing that really concerns me is at school, we often aren't teaching critical thinking skills to young people, and that's not enough to, when they're 13-year-old, we give them a 1-hour lesson on how to fact check headlines. We need to integrate critical thinking skills throughout all education. There's been work
like Finland.
Like Finland. I've been having discussions about academics about how effective that's been in Finland, but generally the impression is it's a good idea. I think Estonia's done it to a certain extent. The Netherlands was also doing some work in that area, but that's really, really crucial. Because again, we are the individuals who are distributing information, that we are verifying ourselves. And if you're using a smartphone from when you're 11 years old and we aren't teaching you critical thinking skills, you're going to be drawn into that type of disordered discourse, that disordered information from a very early age. And then how are we going to get you out of it? Because of course, when you're 16, telling you how to fact check headlines and why Andrew Tate is bad is not going to help anyone at that point. So we need to start from primary into secondary education, and then have opportunities to, through university education, actually engage with kind of different kinds of investigative work, I think. And I think without doing that, we're going to have a lot of problems in society, because I strongly believe that if you follow the logic of like everything I've been doing, I've been driving myself insane looking at every single perspective on this, doing lots of reading, that just the default state of our society is sliding towards authoritarianism without actual, you know, fixes to it. And those aren't impossible fixes. They're definitely achievable, but they have to be worked on. And the lesson after World War I is you have to work on democracy. That democracy doesn't get to a point where it's complete. Every democracy is imperfect. A perfect democracy cannot exist by the very nature of how democracy and society functions, but we can build systems that allow counterpublics to form in a healthy democratic way that can inform the core public and change society in a systematic way. And that's not always easy, and certainly, the 60s and 70s proved it's not always easy. But the fact is, at the moment, we don't even have that. And I think we end up with what I would call disordered counterpublics that are based around disordered discourse that can't really achieve anything apart from getting really mad about stuff. And that really only leads to division and violence.
Is it fair to say, because I'm sometimes quite acerbic about, I get really frustrated when people say, "Oh, politicians are all the same," and it's just, and I think there is a bit of political laziness. But then it's like, well, why is that? Is it because people haven't been inspired enough? But then, you've got to do some work to get interested in, but to understand that politics is really important. I don't know. There's a kind of like chicken and the egg. Whose responsibility is it to draw people into politics? But I don't like they're all the same, because then it's like, I can't be bothered to think about politics, to make a decision. So I'm just going to therefore vote for the populist who gives me the simplest message that is the answer to the most complex problem. And it is invariably not good enough.
And I think the problem we have in our democracies is we don't sell the value of democracy to people, partly because we actually don't create any value in democracy for people. And for me, it's as simple as that. Again, I go back to those 3 questions we ask around verification, deliberation, and accountability. If you ask yourself the questions of, can I find the truth? Can my voice be heard? Can the powerful be held to account? I would ask the audience and everyone watching this, how many times you're answering no to those questions? And if you're answering no to those questions all the time, do you think you're living in a democracy? Because it certainly won't feel like you're living in a democracy if you feel like you have no real power.
Yeah, I've got a question on verification, because I do worry that some people might think, well, who's the arbiter of verification? Like, does Eliot Higgins just think he has the keys to being to knowing whether something's true or not, and he only uses the source and blah blah blah, and then it's this case of, well, for every claim I'm making of facticity or not, then I'm having to establish the whole process I've got here. So at some point I'm just going to shortcut and say, no, I'm not listening to that source or whatever. But there's the idea of like, is there the accusation? Is there a decent accusation of like being the arbiter of verifying?
Well, the way I see it is those 3 ideas are kind of the verification, deliberation, and accountability are democratic ideals. That none of them are ever going to be done perfectly, because we have to live in a real world society rather than one of theories and ideals. And that verification, certainly they've been established throughout the 20th century as a kind of really big principle, but also at the same time they've been delivered imperfectly. But what's important is we can challenge the imperfections of democracy in a way that actually changes how our democracies function. So when we start identifying flaws with, say, the scientific method around a certain topic, or the way editorial controls work, there's certain groups that are excluded, certain voices that aren't heard. How do we actually approach and change that? Because we've kind of had that ability kind of stripped out of society over the last 30 or 40 years. And it's become harder and harder without going through kind of a certain career path to influence that in any significant way. As a member of the public, your voice has become quieter and quieter and quieter, but you've been told that you're freer and freer and freer, but it's a certain kind of freedom. And it's the freedom that allows you to work as hard as possible to make as much as money and be as successful as possible based on the terms of kind of meritocracy, which in itself is a corrosive idea. But we need to look at verification not as saying there's only going to ever be one perfect way of verifying things, but understanding it's part of a process. All of these are processes that we can work on and improve, but those processes in a way are handed over to other institutions through the 20th century, that we rely on the media to verify information for us. We hope that the government will tell us the truth, but we have people who will tell us when they're lying. But if we don't trust those institutions to deliver that process for us, where does that process exist? We instead get a replacement through social media that isn't really about verification. It's about the performance of verification. That's really about serving us content that we either get mad about or that we want to see. and reinforcing our current beliefs, which is not healthy because that leads to splinterings of reality into different bubbles.
So, we know that falsehoods travel 6 times faster than truth. And so therefore, if someone like you and your entity, you're up against it in trying to be heard, right? So how do you get heard? How does truth take primacy? How does it deliver in a way that it can outcompete falsehood?
Well, I think there's a few different ways we've approached that in the history of Bellingcat. One of them is to focus on making sure we're producing really high quality evidence that if it ever gets to the point of being used in court, it can be used in court, which, we would say is the ultimate institution in terms of what's true or not, even though they're imperfect as well. But we've developed a process around legal accountability using open source evidence. We're going to publish a report soon, a very long report on the shelling of a city in Ukraine that details a lot of that process. So there's the kind of process itself is really important, and connecting that to institutions who can use that effectively and making those institutions understand how and why they should be using that effectively is important. But that's kind of at the top end of it. At the bottom end, you also need to have a kind of grassroots movement. That one of the most effective kind of responses to disinformation and disordered discourse I've seen has been the invasion of Ukraine in 2022. Because as you know, there was a lot of Russian disinformation, videos of Polish saboteurs blowing up chlorine storage tanks and fake stuff like that. But what I saw is because we'd spent the last 8 years working on Ukraine, sharing our open source investigation techniques, building a kind of community, not necessarily on purpose, just one grew around the work of Bellingcat and the topic of Ukraine that understood how to use open source investigation skills, that a lot of this stuff was debunked literally within an hour of it being published online, which stopped it entering those systems of disordered discourse where it would have become the truth. So building that resilience through building communities is really important. And that's the thing, is you can't have 8 years of war to build that. You need to do it in a more systematic way, which is why I think education has to lead the way, and it has to be embedded in critical thinking skills in schools. But you also need the opportunity for people to do more than just fact check. And that's also something we saw with the build up to the invasion of Ukraine, where you had people who were geolocating videos of Russian troop movements on Twitter. That was then being used by organizations like Bellingcat, the Center for Information Resilience, to kind of map this stuff out and kind of re-verify this stuff. So it became part of a process that went from the kind of public space into these more institutional spaces like Bellingcat, that then was used by even bigger institutions. We have our ukraine.bellingcat.com civilian harm map, and that's used by over a dozen different kind of very well-established institutions, demining efforts, UN departments and stuff like that. But a lot of that has come through a process that began on those public spaces. So it's kind of how do we, educate people? How do we create processes that understand the connection between those public spaces and the institutions in a healthier way? And how do we actually do this in a way that's systematic across society rather than reactionary to whatever is the next crisis? Because if we keep doing that, we'll just be playing whack-a-mole with disinformation for the rest of our lives.
Yeah, so I mean, I guess it's going to be a case of just needing an awful lot of funding, Eliot, for your efforts to actually systematically or to put these things systematically in place. And do you get support from governments?
No, we don't take government funding. We get it from various institutional funders. We get money from postcode lotteries. We raise money ourselves. I would say, though, it's not just about what Bellingcat can do. It's about developing networks of organizations who have different specializations. A big part of what we do is collaboration, because I mean, the world is too big and complex for us to do everything, let alone understand it. But there are lots of organizations, and this is part of why I'm mapping these tracks out with the ARC framework, who do very similar or work that crosses over or has a certain synergy with each other. And if we can build those networks and those communities in a proactive manner and build it from the grassroots up and from the top down, and they meet in the middle, then that creates something that's actually really, really strong and powerful. I mean, it's not just a theory. I mean, I've seen this working really, really well with Ukraine. We've done similar stuff with the work we've done with Syria. The work I did back in 2013 on the sauna attacks a year or two ago was used to issue an arrest warrant for President Assad. So, this stuff can sometimes take a long time, but it can have an impact. But there's lots of opportunities for this to happen, but we need to realize that this is the way forwards. Just going back and thinking we need the media to be trusted again, and we need the government to be more trustworthy.
Yeah,
that will magically happen. Won't happen.
Because actually, as we're sort of wrapping this up, I mean, the key is, how do we get trust in the institutions back? That is part of this as well, like you've said, and those, that's really difficult one to solve, I would have thought, because it's kind of vague anyway, and it's, there are many different types of institutions and so on and so forth, and it's, that can't just get solved like that. These are long-term projects and processes. But the other thing I would like to see is real-time fact-checking, and we do have the tech to be able to do that. I would love to see Trump fact check live on TV with, just to see in a debate. The problem is that people live in their bubbles, and Fox News, if they don't do any fact checking, and most people get their news from Fox News, then you see, this is the accountability. Fox News are not accountable. This is why it went back to litigation for me earlier. It's like, that seems to be the only way of getting those feckers accountable, because otherwise they're just an amplifier for someone like Donald Trump and for people who are fast and loose with their truths. And it's just, or their falsehoods.
And I really believe this has to be about the grassroots efforts, not just because it's nice to do, but it also means that they can see democracy function and understand the functions of democracy, because it's that kind of I think it comes back to this idea of having kind of democratic middle managers running everything and not being very visible to the public. So when stuff goes wrong, or even on a personal level, on a public level, people don't understand why it's going wrong, and their debates aren't really debates about the facts. They're debates about opinions, because they can't even grasp the facts because they're so far away because of just the way the entire system is being structured, and that they're being flooded with constant information that either makes them mad or reinforces what they already believe. So it just flattens the whole landscape in terms of verification, deliberation, and accountability. So nothing can really ever be achieved in a great democratic system, or understood to be achieved, and we just regress towards authoritarianism as the default state.
Yeah, it's somewhat depressing, but great that there are people like yourself and organisations like yourself that absolutely concerned with righting the wrongs. I just want to do some thanks to some people: Johnny Nevregard, Kevin Forst, and Ebson Mikkelsen, who also says we have that in Denmark. It's called media tax. You have to pay regardless of whether you have a TV. It funds public media. We have that sort of with the BBC. I think public service broadcasters get a bit of a bad rap, but they are super important. But the problem is we're not very good at communicating the value of these things. And actually, you can say that about governments in general. Like, for example, the Labour government at the moment, the UK is in a bit of trouble for X, Y, and Z. But they're not very good at saying, look at all the good things we've done since we've been in charge, for example. Or the EU didn't do a very good job of saying, or the Remain campaign during Brexit, look at all the good things the EU has done for so Trump is amazing at selling all the good things he's done, and even the things he hasn't done that he just says he's done. And I think we should take a lesson from Trump and say, look, we need to be shouting about the positives that are achieved by the democracy we have, by the systems we have, trying, anyway, that's a whole other.
Well, you may have seen the report from the Lancet today that estimates the amount of deaths from the cutting of US aid funding, and that's going to be about 14.1 million according to their estimates.
I know you commented on it, yeah.
And that, that's more than all the wars of the 21st century added together, as far as from my initial attempts at maths on this. But, they're doing a hugely important service, yet they can be destroyed overnight just because it's a political convenience for someone, and millions of people have to die for that. And again, that's about communicating what these organizations do to the public.
That's a really good point. Yeah, just I guess sort of finally, I mean, it was such a shame that the Cato Institute, which is, for those who don't know, sort of free market institute, sort of, I guess, culturally right wing to a degree, sort of libertarian, but I always think a lot of libertarian organizations are kind of faux libertarian. As soon as you start talking about immigration, like, no, we've got to stop people moving. Like, yeah, isn't that kind of libertarian? Anyway, but Cato Institute says has a new paper on misinformation panic, so kind of downplaying the impact of disinformation and misinformation. Do you have any comment on that? I know you went to town on it in this thread.
Yeah, I mean, There is this kind of idea, I think it comes from the kind of right in the US in particular, in the UK as well, that it's kind of overblown. Disinformation is overblown. And I think that's just so incredibly naive, and it fundamentally misunderstands the situation. And I think that's often because they come from a position of privilege. That,
Right.
you know, when you're coming from, you know, a well-educated background, you aren't thinking about people who don't have the same advantages that you do. And that ultimately results in a misunderstanding what the situation is, that this is some kind of big liberal panic rather than a kind of systematic collapse of our, you know, how we actually come to agreeing. I mean, I would say, you know, there's this idea we live in a post-truth society, but in a sense we live in a post-consent society, that we can't come to any democratic consensus about what to do about the world because we become so splintered. And that's the real crisis, that we can't even agree what to do about the problems, or even what the problems are in the first place.
Yeah, God, it's all so chaotic. Really great, because I think, you know, the EU needs to be doing an awful lot about this. The UK, you know, any government needs to be working on this as a big primary issue. And you know, it's good to see the EU versus disinfo. There are you know, entities out there, but are they prevalent enough? Is there enough funding? Is there enough focus on the fact that disinformation, misinformation, malinformation, they are presenting an epistemic security crisis? You know, here you were commenting that Zelensky and the Council of Europe are to launch a tribunal for war in Ukraine. Good to see is hopefully Bellingcat can contribute, and you know they're just that's slightly different situation, but yeah, I just think that there needs to be a lot of focus from the top down, but as you say, also from the bottom up. There needs to be grassroots, but also a recognition at the top that this is a threat to our national security, and actually a threat to our democracy, as you have very well pointed out. Just a couple of comments that I thought might be relevant for you. Kathy's guest says, Eliot, please write another book on this subject geared towards children up to middle school age. I've been fighting for education in poor areas for over 20 years. A book would help me with a curriculum. So
we are trying to produce more educational material across the board. That will include online content. We actually ran a program with a group called the Student View in the UK, where we went and I think we trained 100 or 200 teachers to deliver content around verification to their students. Sadly, the Student View went bankrupt in the assessment period, so we've no idea how successful that was, but anecdotally it was well received. But it's certainly an area where we're trying to produce more content to kind of really explain these topics to different people, because I think what I found really interesting in how people have reacted to this is that people kind of see it straight away, that when it's put into that context, they say, yeah, I can see, you know, how this applies to this situation I've encountered, or, you know, the questions that I say people should ask. Yeah, those questions I'm saying no to an awful lot at the moment. So that's, I think, really helpful.
Yeah, awesome. Yeah, thank you, Jonathan and Mr. Higgins. You're both doing amazing, impressive, important work, and most probably earn way too little for the massive work that you do for humanity. Yes, humanity. I mean, some people, I think, would agree that this is not what I do, but although I do often wonder what I do, you know, what I always, I mean, at least I do like look at myself and say, am I grifting? You know, is what I have now a job. I've got multiple sclerosis. I can't do my regular job. I used to be a teacher. I can't do that anymore, but I was morally drawn to Ukraine. And so, you know, it is morality sits at the heart of what I do. And my background in philosophy gives me, I think, a good foundation for verifying and so on and so forth for critical thought. But I'm always really wary as to what motivates what I do, and you know, the kind of things that I do. Just as a very last thing for you, I mean, is this anything that you think about? What drives you personally? And I don't expect you to go making loads of money.
I think the one thing that I always come back to is that I've seen time and time again people that are, you know, otherwise wouldn't have really had any kind of power make a really big difference. You know, I came from a background, you know, I was working in admin before I started doing this work. And I've seen lots of people from a variety of different backgrounds that would be traditionally considered, you know, influential in society, you know, doing amazing investigative works, building careers about that, you know, really bringing accountability to stuff. I mean, there's been murders and victims of child abuse rescued because of, you know, this collaborative work that we've been doing over the years. So I constantly see the value of it, and that especially in this moment when there is such a negative pressure on democracy, how important that is, not just for knowing what the facts are about a certain topic, but throughout society.
Wonderful. Yeah, I mean, what you do is truly meaningful. It matters. It matters. It has that that impact. We didn't get to speak too much about conspiracy theories. I wanted, I remember seeing Rob Brotherton at Portsmouth Skeptics in a pub, and he's written a book on conspiracy theories. And I wanted to talk about like the commonalities between in for a penny, in for a pound. People generally, if they believe one, they believe them all, and blah blah blah. So much more to talk about on this topic. Eliot, what can we do? What can the audience do to help out as much as possible in terms of your objectives?
Well, I would say, I mean, if you want to get involved, we have a Discourse server that I would point people towards. You can find it on the Bellingcat website. That'll be your first open source investigation, getting the details of that. But we have a great community there. They look into stuff, they get involved with investigations, but also kind of thinking your own life. Just think about those kind of 3 principles that I'm talking about, and think that, when you're on the internet sharing stuff, thinking about what you're sharing, just ask yourself a kind of question about, is this really upholding those 3 ideals? And then, if everyone does that, then I think everyone gets the opportunity to make a little difference to democracy.
Well, JR, everyone knows JR here. He says the Discourse server is great, so that's a sound endorsement there. Well, look, I really appreciate you coming on, Eliot. Thank you for your valuable time. I would absolutely love to talk to you again. You're welcome to platform anything that you are doing, want to talk about, want to shout about to the audience here. And there's plenty, I guess, to talk about in terms of, say, particular places like Russia, Ukraine. We didn't really talk about that in any explicit detail, so I'm sure there's plenty more to talk about, and if you are willing at any point in the future to come back on, I'd absolutely love to have you. Thank you very much for your time. Final words to you.
I would say that we are going through a really, really tough period at the moment as a society, and that it does take effort to fix that. But I've learned from my work and from the communities I've engaged with that everyone can be involved with that in big ways and small. And don't worry about doing it in a small way, because if there's 1 million people doing it in a small way, then that's awfully big.
Yeah, I remember saying this is about veganism. You don't want something like one perfect vegan is not as good as like a million imperfect vegans, but like that idea is the same for anything. I mean, I'm not trying to espouse bloody veganism or whatever, but it's just the idea is like we all do just become a little bit better. We don't have to be like the perfect iteration of anything, but if we can all strive to be better at what we are and what we do and how we do things, then everyone doing that just makes an inordinate amount of difference. Thanks, Eliot. You stay on the line there, and but in the meantime, thank you very much to the audience. Thanks for all your support. You guys take care, and I will speak to you soon. Toodle pips.